I love Resident Evil, and I am so excited for Resident Evil Requiem coming in on the RE engine. Now, RE engine has had some absolutely awfully optimized games. Monster Hunter Wilds comes to mind, and even with Title Update 4, still really heavy on the CPU, still really heavy on the GPU, and not offering a lot of visual, I would say bang for the buck as far as, performance to visual ratio. Also, Dragon's Dogma 2 was not great either, although I think not quite as bad as Monster Hunter Wilds. But we've also seen some games run really well on RE engine, including the Resident Evil games, for the most part, have looked really good for the performance cost. And I think the big difference here is whether we're looking at a more closed-in sort of environment or a more open-world environment. Certainly seems like RE engine is a lot more performant in those more enclosed spaces. And with that in mind, let's talk about the system requirements, because when they were initially posted on Steam, I didn't bother making a video because honestly, they didn't say a whole lot. We had minimum and recommended with no resolution or frame rate target. So there wasn't a lot to say other than even the recommended specs look pretty reasonable. An RTX 2060 Super 8GB or Radeon RX 6600 8GB for the GPUs, 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is more expensive than it used to be, but hey, at least it's not 32. And then the processor, a Core i7 8700 and AMD Ryzen 5 5500. Nothing crazy even for the recommended, but what does recommended even mean, right? What settings, what resolution, what frame rate? Now, the reason I'm doing a video now is I've noticed something. When I was testing out the Pragmata demo, which also runs on RE engine and is releasing within a few months of Resident Evil Requiem, so from the same company using the same engine, and also seems to be more of, at least in the demo space that we were able to test out so far, seems to be more of the Resident Evil style scale of the game. More closed-in environments, smaller areas, not big open world. So, maybe later in the game or something like that, it does open up. We don't know at this point. That'll be something worth testing out when we get there. At least so far, the Pragmata demo performed extremely well. But that by itself doesn't say anything other than when you check the system requirements for Pragmata, you notice something. Okay, so I'm looking at the recommended specs. RTX 2060 Super 8GB, Radeon RX 6600 8GB. Wait, have I seen that before? Let's flip back to Resident Evil. Oh, wait a minute, let's put these side by side. They're exactly the same minimum and recommended specs, but Pragmata gave us the additional notes on what sort of performance and graphic settings to expect, as well as the playable demo, which I've already benchmarked on the channel, which is why I'm now bothering to make a video about the PC system requirements for Resident Evil Requiem, which again, by themselves didn't seem to mean a whole lot. But now that we can compare it with Pragmata and actually performance testing in Pragmata, I think this now gives us a lot more to say. That's what I'm getting at here. So, how did my testing of Pragmata go? And then what kind of performance were they specifying for this hardware? And I think that gives us a good idea of what to expect from Resident Evil Requiem. Because again, same engine, similar scale of the game, at least from what we can tell so far. Games aren't fully out yet, so of course let me know in the comment section if you want me to benchmark Resident Evil Requiem at launch. So I tested out the game on, again, Pragmata, not RE Requiem, but right, we're using this kind of a stand-in to get a rough idea of maybe what to expect here. So on an RTX 3060, 12GB Ryzen 5 5600X base system at 1080p, it defaulted to the higher preset. I think some individual settings could have been turned up, so it wasn't complete maximum, but it did default to having the ray tracing turned on. And even in combat, we can see the frame rate right here, and then this is the average frame rate for overall playing through the level, and then the 1% lows. We can see if I let it go here, even during combat, the frame rate is staying over 60 FPS and the frame time graph looks very, very smooth. One thing I really like about RE Engine in these smaller scale titles, where I think it's really well optimized, is that we usually get these beautifully smooth frame time graphs. So again, even on a, 5-year-old GPU at this point, I know it's making me feel old because I started this channel around when these first came out. Anyway, But the point is, even on like a 5-ish year old GPU with ray tracing turned on, native 1080p, by the way, here, this was not using DLSS or anything. Nearly maximum settings were well over 60 FPS, etc. Now, I know some people would want a much higher frame rate too, but again, this is near maximum settings at native resolution, so there's a lot of room to scale. And I did test out, for example, turning ray tracing off to see what that did to the frame rate, and things were a bit higher, but weren't like absolutely mind-blowing or anything like that. So if I jump to this same sort of scene, but with the ray tracing off, we can see that the frame rates are closer to 70 rather than 60, although during combat it does drop into the 60s. So again, you can gain a little bit of frame rate by turning ray tracing off. Now, that is one thing that I'll want to look out for with Resident Evil Requiem is what sort of ray tracing effects they have and how far they let you push it. Because one of my only criticisms of the Pragmata demo that we got here, and this is a criticism I've had for most Resident Evil titles, or not even just Resident Evil titles, but most games using RE engine that offer ray tracing, is that I do wish they allowed the resolution of the ray traced reflections to be pushed to a higher setting for PCs that can handle it. Because while I do find that the ray tracing is very performant compared to a lot of other titles, I find that it can look a little bit grainy in the reflections to a point that I find actually distracting and would sometimes prefer to have it turned off rather than on, purely from a visual standpoint rather than just a performance standpoint. So I would like there to be ray tracing settings that allow you to push it to a level that actually offers something clearly better visually for the performance cost. Anyway, I also tested out the Pragmata demo on more modern mid-range-ish. Again, what do you call mid-range? I don't know, guys, but 5060 Ti. Both the 16 gigabyte and 8 gigabyte versions, and I was looking at the performance here at 1440p native resolution without upscaling. And while this initial area is a little bit closed in, I did also jump into that same kind of combat sequence in a slightly larger area, still fairly small. And here we were getting, again, this was, by this point I had kicked on DLSS balance, but using DLSS on a 1440p screen, ray tracing on, again, those almost but not quite maxed out settings, we're hitting 100 FPS or so. So the point is that it's looking like the current version of RE engine for these kind of smaller scale environments is performant even as far back as the 3060. If you're on a more modern system, you can easily be getting triple digit frame rates. And honestly, even without the DLSS turned on, while we weren't necessarily triple digits all the time, we were getting pretty good frame rates as well, oftentimes in the 80 to 90 range, etc. So again, it's a lot easier to run games that are more closed-in environments than the big open world titles, but that certainly seems to be helping the performance. So that's what I kind of tested out here. Now again, it is a different game, but releasing within months of each other, similar scale, same engine. Now, as far as what the system requirements are actually claiming, they're saying that on the recommended system for Pragmata, which was the RTX 2060 Super 8GB and Radeon RX 6600 8GB, that you'd be around 1080p 60 FPS at the balanced preset. But acknowledging that the frame rate could drop, and that if you're trying to use ray tracing effects, notice that they are mentioning 12 gigabyte cards, whereas the recommended GPUs are 8 gigabytes. So it's looking like the game should run fine without ray tracing on 8 gigabyte cards, but if you want to use ray tracing effects, you would want more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I would expect the same thing to happen with RE Requiem, since even in previous RE engine games like the Resident Evil 4 remake, etc., I did notice that 8 gigabytes VRAM ran mostly okay at lower resolutions unless you turned on ray tracing, where it kind of turned into a bit of a disaster. Now, the minimum requirements are even lower. We're down to a GTX 1660 or RX 5500 XT. If we want to get an idea for how this scales, I recommend Tech Power Up's relative performance chart. So if we go to like a 1660, wait, did it say super? No, just 1660, the 6 gigabyte version though, just because was there still lower than, no, I don't think there was a lower than 6 gigabyte version for this card, but here, we're clicking on that. So at Tech Power Ups, all my sources will be in the video description, by the way. Relative performance chart. Now, to be clear, this isn't necessarily saying how this is going to perform in a particular game. But what they give you is a relative performance chart where you can kind of get an idea how this scales. So a lot of times people have trouble with, okay, my GPU isn't on the recommended or minimum specs page, so how do I compare? So if the 1660 is the minimum, you can then scroll down or scroll up, find your GPU. Like, let's say maybe you have an RTX 2060. You can tell that you're 32% above the minimum spec for the game. Maybe you have an RX 6600, which again was a recommended GPU. That's 47%. So we can also see that there's about a 50% scaling in between their minimum and their recommended GPUs in the system requirement chart. So this can get an idea of how your system kind of stacks up against this. Also, do keep in mind the VRAM quantities that they're mentioning here. It does look like even the minimum specs are asking for a 6 gigabyte card. That doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't go less than 6 gigabytes. But it's also not confirming that you could run it on something less than that. Now, they're saying that in the additional notes for Pragmata, which again, not the same thing as RE Requiem, but we're kind of using it to infer some stuff. They're estimating performance between 1080p 45 FPS in performance preset with some drops in graphics-intensive scenes. Notice they are also recommending an SSD, and the CPUs as well, not super crazy. One thing I want to mention on the CPU side of things is that even their recommended CPU, like a Ryzen 5 5500, is not super crazy. For example, when I was doing my testing of Pragmata on the older system, I was using a Ryzen 5 5600X, and I was GPU limited here. I was not CPU limited, which again, if you look at certain I keep saying Resident Evil engine, RE engine, which I think is it Reach for the Moon engine? Is that what it actually stands for? Not Resident Evil. Anyway, the point is, in Monster Hunter Wilds, Dragon's Dogma 2, you can get very CPU limited, but that tends to be in the more populated areas. So I think that if this is a less populated game, which seems to be the case based on previous Resident Evil titles and what we've seen so far in the trailers, and in Pragmata, I was GPU limited at reasonable frame rates on this type of a system. So didn't seem like the CPU is going to be super demanding. That being said, if we take something like the Ryzen 5 5500 and look for some updated testing on that, Hardware Unboxed, who publishes text-based versions of their most of their benchmarking at TechSpot, and again, sources in the video description, has recently taken another look at the Ryzen 5 5500. Again, the 5500 is the recommended CPU for the game. And it's not that powerful, which is kind of the point. Not that it doesn't get the job done in current games, but the point is, like, if you were on a new mid-range system with something like a Ryzen 5 9600X, you have something significantly more powerful than what they are asking for with the Ryzen 5 5500. Like for newer Intel CPUs like the Core Ultra 5 225F, that's also more powerful than what we're seeing from the Ryzen 5 5500. The 5500 is more in line with a Intel Core i5 12400F, but running DDR4, slower than it running DDR5, because remember, that generation of Intel CPUs offered motherboards that could either be DDR5 or DDR4. You would kind of pick one for your system build. Anyway, so the point is the Ryzen 5 5500 not asking for a ton on the CPU side of things either. So overall, I would say that while this is not the same thing as testing out the game, I would say that everything we can infer based on the system requirements and how similar they are to Pragmata and the testing I was able to do in Pragmata, all signs point to RE Requiem likely being a pretty performant game. I'm hoping that ends up being the case. We'll have to see. And I am certainly excited to actually play it because I tend to quite enjoy these RE games. Again, when we see some kind of combat style here, again, this looks to be more in line with what we're kind of seeing from Pragmata. And then we're getting February 27th, 2026 for the release date. So let me know if you guys want me to benchmark the game when it releases. I probably plan on buying it anyway, just to play myself. So shouldn't be too hard to get some benchmark content. If you're interested, let me know in the comments. I hope all of you have an excellent day.